As I said this morning, we are particularly interested in the concomitant failure of multiple coupled systems. I think institutions and economic systems are uniquely interdependent with many of the systems whose failure we've already discussed today. With that as prologue, let me introduce Suresh Naidu. Suresh is an external professor here at SFI. He's also a professor of economics and public affairs at Columbia University. He's an expert in the economic effects of political transitions, which I suspect means he's incredibly busy these days, and we're grateful to have him here with us. And so maybe with that as prologue, Suresh, let me turn it over to you to get us going.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for doing this. So what I wanted to sort of talk about is a little bit present some evidence from my research, which is sort of, which I didn't really realize had this theme through it until COVID hit. And I was like, oh, it turns out a lot of the things I had looked at involve kind of some big economic shock happening and then looking at the subsequent changes. And so here we are. And so what I thought I'd talk about is just kind of some raw facts and sort of how we in economics kind of learn from historical data and have and can look at these big shocks that have happened in the past and how they've changed things. And what I'm going to do is present silver linings, if you will. So I'm going to be talking about those crises that have basically led to, in retrospect, we think, well, that was probably a pretty good change that happened that was really forced on a population or a country by some big negative shock, and it kind of bounced that society out of, say, one equilibrium into another equilibrium. And generally economic crises are precipitators of these kinds of big institutional changes, which are often pretty sudden. So like institutions will go along for a long time under their own inertia, and then very quickly in the space of like less than half a generation, they will be radically transformed. And so that's kind of what I'm after. And so I'm going to talk about three different levels at which we can kind of look at these crisis-driven institutional transitions. So what I'm going to talk about first is kind of a very high level paper that's like as high level as you can get, but it's basically on the relationship between democracy and economic development. And it really took being able to, I think what we noticed that in this paper I'm going to talk about, what we noticed that other people hadn't noticed is that unless you really handle the crisis that precipitates a transition to democracy, you're going to get the counterfactual all wrong. And so in order to form kind of a correct counterfactual in which to assess the effects of democracy on economic growth and development, you kind of really need to handle empirically the fact that, countries don't randomly switch, they're precipitated by some sort of economic crisis. And so what you want to do is kind of form the control group looking at other countries that went through a pretty similar crisis but didn't undergo the same institutional change. So that's what we kind of do in this paper with Acemoglu and Robinson and Restrepo. So that's at the sort of cross-country level. Then I want to talk about more at the like cross-state level in the US, and talking about the peculiar transition to a partial social democracy that happened in the US in mid-century, and how the New Deal in World War II really pushed a whole bunch the New Deal and World War II into a different, more equal distribution of income. And then finally, what I want to talk about is historical racial inequality, I'm going to draw on a paper I did a long time ago on the 1927 Mississippi flood. And one of the interesting things about the 1927 Mississippi flood is that it's another, like, the Mississippi Delta just floods. But interestingly, the levees only break in some places and don't break in other places. And so you have this kind of very interesting historical experiment where the places that got flooded, it was basically a minor humanitarian disaster, but it also induced a huge Black outmigration. So it's one of the push factors in the Great Migration is in around the Mississippi Delta, the places that got hit with the Mississippi flood, that got flooded, experienced a large Black outmigration. And what you can use that for is to figure out how much, for example, planters and farmers in that area valued Black labor, and look at what they did when that labor left. And what I'll show you is how the agricultural systems in those counties that got flooded just kind of completely transformed as a result of this Black outmigration. So what we'll see is that the flooded counties here just wind up modernizing their agriculture at a much earlier time than sort of the counties right next door that didn't get flooded. So let me talk about the first one in some more details. So if anyone that's looked into this question, it's like kind of one of the big questions. There's been endless papers written using both quantitative and qualitative accounts about what's the relationship between between democracy and economic development. And basically, because the level of variation that democracy kind of lives at is pretty much a country, the style of work in this area, and it's like kind of one of the oldest cross-country regressions you can imagine running, is what's the regression of just GDP per capita on whether or not a country is a democracy. And then what you can do that's better than that is look at changes, at democratization. So you look kind of like at all the countries that experience a transition from dictatorship to democracy or from democracy to dictatorship, and you kind of look at, okay, when those countries change, does their rate of economic growth then change? And so in that kind of exercise, you're not trying to compare like the US to China, which is just kind of confounded by hopeless numbers of things that you couldn't hope to control for. You're really sort of trying to look at when holding the other characteristics of the countries constant, when it changes from non-democracy to democracy, does its level of economic development change? But even this experiment is pretty hard to get to behave properly. So even when you run this kind of very basic regression, you can get all kinds of answers. So depending on what you do. So what we did that I think cleans up this literature and tells you at least what you could learn from this data, which might not be I think pushes this kind of exercise to as far as it can go. And I think what turns out to do the trick is that you have to account for the fact that a switch from dictatorship to democracy generally happens after an economic crisis. So what you want to do is you want to form the experiment where the countries, here, let me show you the slide. So this is if you just look at the data of like GDP per capita around a democratization, you basically see that's like there's this big cliff that happens in the year around a transition to democracy. A country basically undergoes some sort of economic crisis, and so if you didn't handle this economic crisis that's leading you to switch into democracy, you would get a totally spurious effect on economic development, because that subsequent rebound would be confounded by just the rebound from the economic crisis. So what you want to do is kind of form a counterfactual where it's like you have two countries, both of which experience the same kind of crisis, one of which switches into democracy and the other one doesn't. And once you do that exercise, you kind of get a very clean and robust effect of democratization on economic development, which is roughly something like 1.5 percentage points a year. Increase in GDP per capita. So over 25 years, you get something like a 20% increase in GDP. which is not too big, it's not too small. It's around the kind of number that in my mind sort of like makes sense. And importantly, there's nothing like prior to that. So once you handle the like 4 years of GDP before democratization, there's no like pre-existing structural trend. There's no other sort of confounds that you really have to worry about. And we sort of document this in the paper that basically handling this economic crisis gives you kind of a pretty good experiment as far as you can go with this kind of cross-country data. I'm sure that's going to be controversial, so I'm happy to talk about it. The next thing I want to talk about is going into this this labor market transition that I mentioned in the Wagner Act and World War II. It's also just kind of interesting, and the history is just kind of interesting and relevant. It's, you know, the Wagner Act is this piece of law that basically legalized unions in the U.S. Like effectively, I mean, there's sporadic bits here and there, but really unions prior to 1935 were, you know, always under legal attack. And then in 1935, the Wagner Act was passed in the context of a recovery from the Great Depression. In lots of people are still on unemployment, and so in the middle of all of this crisis, the Roosevelt administration passes the Wagner Act, and it was also widely believed that it was not going to matter. So basically, everybody was convinced that the Supreme Court was going to strike it down within a year or so. In the past rhyming with the present, Roosevelt threatens to pack the court in February 1937, and then lo and behold, the Supreme Court upholds the law in April of that year. And one of the consequences of that is like you have a sudden big increase in union density, kind of, you know, one of the only moments that you've had like a big increase in union density in the US. And then that just gets multiplied by the World War II War Labor Board basically mandating that if you were producing for the war, you had to be in compliance with the Wagner Act. So then these two kind of things of the Wagner Act and then essentially taking 10% of the US economy and saying, if you're producing for the war, you now have to respect the law, protecting unions, you got this really big increase in union density. And one of the interesting things about that is that, like, while lots of other things about the economy changed in World War II, most of those things changed back. Almost all of those things change back when the war ends. But unionization is one of those things that persists. And so you just think of like the labor market in 1940, 48, 49, it's, you know, it's not a war economy. It's basically has turned back into a civilian economy, but you effectively have like 1 in every 3 households is a union member. And that's just like a radically different labor market than what existed in 1934. It's a radically different labor market from what we have today. And it's you know, it's a pretty drastic change. And I think what we did in this paper that I'm referring to, we basically produced kind of some of the first estimates of union density back in this period, because it turns out like no one asked in sort of the census or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, no one ever asked, are you in a union, until 1973. So most of what economists have known and thought about unions comes from like 1973 on, which is kind of a period of just monotonic union decline. So let me show you this graph. So this is like the shape of unions. Union density is the green and purple squares, the green triangles and the purple squares. The purple straight line is the Gini coefficient, and the dashed blue line is the top 10% share of income. Lots of people have shown graphs like this, but importantly, that purple, before like our work in this area, that purple squared line was all that people really had that had like individual level data. And what we sort of noticed, what our contribution to this literature is that turns out, you know, who was always asking about union status was Gallup polls. So basically pollsters starting in like 1936 always asked, are you a union member or not? And we could basically go back and collect all of these old Gallup polls. And once you start collecting them, you get millions and millions of observations because they're done, or like a million observations because they're done every month or a couple of months. And then you can kind of form a new data set that goes all the way back to the heyday of unions and really like look at who's in a union. And in particular, you can look at what states experience the increase in union density, which is something you couldn't look at really before. And what we kind of show here, I'll talk about this, maybe skip over this. This is just showing that the Wagner Act mattered. Well, okay, let me talk about this graph on the right. So this is showing in the states, across states, which states got like a lot of new members via the Wagner Act on the x-axis, and then those same states then getting a big increase in war spending during World War II. So think Michigan is an obvious outlier here. It's like Michigan both was like adding tons and tons of union members and was getting a lot of war money, and and both of those things drove union density, and they drove them differentially in these particular states. So think of like Connecticut, New Jersey, Michigan, Ohio. These are states that are getting unions that are, and their unions are not going to Mississippi, Alabama, and Kansas in this period. And so what you can see is like then compare these states that got unions in this period with these states that did not get unions in this period, and look at how inequality changed differently in this period. And that's what this next graph does. So this is the difference between the states that got unions and the states that didn't get unions. And the pink line is the increase in union density that's differential in these states that sort of got that were unionizing in this period. So I think Michigan, Connecticut, Ohio are kind of the pink line, and that's their difference from all the other states. And so they experience a big increase in union density, and at the same time, those exact same states experience a differential decline in the top 10% share of income and a differential increase in the labor share of income. So the labor share of income is the total amount of wages times employment paid. And then that transition really happens only in that critical juncture of that 1935 to 1947 window of the New Deal and and World War II, and then there's kind of no action outside of that window. It's all pretty much flat, and so that's kind of this crisis, this period of American history that really kind of built social democracy in parts of the U.S. And then we kind of had it for a while, and then it's kind of slowly been deteriorating, and again differentially deteriorating in those same states since 1980. Okay, so my last little historical experiment here is looking at this Mississippi flood. So for those of you that don't know, the Jim Crow was this very repressive labor system in the US South where Blacks essentially worked in Southern agriculture, and it really was broken only with like Blacks out-migrating, sort of starting in 1910 and then sort of accelerating over the 20th century to northern cities. And everyone sort of thinks that it was that immigration was really the cause of agricultural modernization in the South, but it's really sort of hard to establish causality, because you want something like an experiment where you get some places that, for reasons unrelated to their agricultural system, had Blacks leave, and then look at the effects of that kind of shock. And this is what the 1927 historical flood does for us. Because we have this thing that the levees broke in some places and not others. And so this map is showing you the places that got flooded. And then we kind of are comparing the places that got flooded to the places kind of just on the other side of the river that didn't get flooded in 1927. And so one of the things we can do with this is calculate, and one of the outcomes we look at, and I'll show you, is land values. And so you can use how much land values declined in the places where blacks left as a measure for how valuable repressed black labor was to planters, because that land value kind of capitalizes the agricultural profits of those farmers. And so that's kind of a way to sort of convert by seeing the effects on land value, you can kind of get a sense of the cost that this imposed on planters. So this is the difference between these flooded and non-flooded counties over time. And so you can kind of see they're pretty similar leading up to the flood. And then after the flood, the black population falls and stays permanently lower. So it's not that new black population comes in to replace the black population that left. It's just like they leave and they're gone and no one comes back in to repopulate these counties. And so that's like you first get this big outmigration due to the flood, and then you get this big increase in mechanization in those same flooded counties. So this is the farm capital. We also look at tractors and acreage under acreage being farmed. And what you're kind of seeing is that these places that lose black labor wind up, basically replacing black labor with tractors. They pull a whole bunch more acreage, low productivity acreage into cultivation. Their output goes up enormously. So they're actually way more productive in agriculture, but their land values fall. And so it's a good example, right? Like, because the costs of production went up, even as the total scale of production went up. And so your profit can fall even though your output goes up a lot. And so you should think of it as like this Mississippi flood hit, and then it forced these planters to adopt this much more technologically advanced agricultural system, but they wouldn't have done it without that flood forcing them to do it, because the previous system was profitable for them. And so that's kind of my last example of kind of how a big crisis in these areas kind of pushed these counties into a more technologically advanced agricultural system that was not necessarily profitable for them beforehand. Okay, so let me just end here with just some thoughts. I'm happy to take any kinds of questions. So why does crisis kind of precipitate this kind of institutional change? Well, often it's the case that institutions persist just because it's too costly to for a group to try something new, and a crisis can induce a particular group that was previously inertial or just kind of trying to get by to do something new. So think of blacks outmigrating after the after the flood. They could have outmigrated before, but it took the flood to kind of push them to finally leave. Or think of the unions in the New Deal that were, had a really hard time organizing, and then the Wagner Act passes, and then they kind of go out and are signing up members left, right, and center. And that forces everyone else to change how that whole little economy works. Is that this the crisis kind of works through a particular group, like deviating from just the practices that were done before, and that changes how everything else is done. Or it could be that any particular subgroup was kind of always pushing for a particular change, and then the crisis makes everyone else finally respond to this particular group that was pushing for change all along. And so you can have different accounts of this process, and probably both of these things are going on. And sort of in work I have with Sam Bowles and others at SFI, we kind of have a bunch of formal models trying to capture these two different logics of institutional transitions. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Suresh. Unfortunately, applause doesn't really work well over Zoom, but I'll encourage people to use their reaction buttons to give the applause. I do want to open this up for general Q&A. As we've mentioned before, the best ways to do that are either to enter your questions into the chat channel or just write question in the chat channel, or use the raise hand button under participants to let us know that you'd like to ask a question. I'd like to kick off, if I could, Suresh,
Yep.
and really push you a little bit on I think, a big question that we've been discussing over the course of the day and will continue to think about tomorrow. We seem to be facing, as a global population, a number of correlated or interdependent crises right now, right? So we have the pandemic, we have a great deal of social unrest, not just in the US, but around the world. We have climate change. When we look at all of these crises coming at once, what types, as someone who studies this, what types of institutional changes do you personally think we could see as a result of that? And to the extent that you feel comfortable even speculating on it, what does that mean, not just for sort of short-term numbers like GDP growth, but really, the structure and long-term health of the economic system as it's currently in place globally?
So I don't. I've found that the pandemic has kind of forced me to narrow my lens to like just keeping track of the policy environment in the United States has been hard enough. So but I have been paying attention to the policy environment in the United States, and it has been actually very, I know it is a catastrophe in many in many levels, but I will suggest that like there are things inside the CARES Act, for example, that really kind of point to a set of policies that we could do kind of going forward in the future. So I think one of the things we learned is that a really generous unemployment insurance system that like kicks in during a crisis like this is actually like pretty good, and that the super UI that we did with the CARES Act was possibly one of the best policies that we've done in a long time. And I think I'd like to think that going forward we'll kind of think about ways to make the social insurance system in the US less like vulnerable to like the political process and much more kind of on an automatic stabilizers. So that like, oh, when the economy hits a downturn, and then we'll basically instead of having to go through Congress, we'll basically have a UI system that is pretty robust and flexible that will kind of automatically kick in. Here's something that that you might not know. So the unemployment system was topped up by the federal government with $600 a week over the course of the pandemic. So if you were unemployed over the pandemic, you were getting $600 a week. I just want to point out $600 a week is like $15 an hour for 40 hours a week. That's more money for a lot of low wage workers that they've ever seen in their lives. And the reason that we did that $600 is because all the unemployment systems are run through the states, and they basically are still operating in like Fortran. And so it was like too complex to update the state software systems to do anything more complicated than just like flat payment of $600 a week. So I think one of the things that I would like, and this is just like a small thing, but it's in my like wheelhouse, is that we've become much better at fixing the social safety net so that when we're dealing with future recessions and things, we are much less vulnerable to the political idiosyncrasies, and we can kind of do it much better. So that's like a small thing that I hope we now have a lot of evidence from this pandemic about how we could do that.
So I think there's a sort of related question from Aaron King. Aaron, do you want to jump in?
I thought that was a very interesting comment you made about the social insurance and its potential to act as a stabilizer in these kind of situations. So I was along those same lines. You've thought a lot more about this than I have. Have you thought about policies that we could put into place that would sort of alleviate the need for major crisis as the sort of instigator of social change? If your thesis is right that essentially you need strong crisis in order to produce some of these social changes, we understand that. Can we sort of smooth the transitions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have, for example, like, because we're actually much better at, like, think of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, didn't really generate huge institutional changes. And that's partly because we managed it much better than we managed the Great Depression, even though it was not pretty by any means, but we didn't hit anything close to the Depression. And so okay, so that's like why we didn't get institutional change. And then so one would hope that that what we've done is, for example, build a democratic and bureaucratic system that's much better at doing its own like form of adaptive learning, of figuring out like, okay, this thing happened, we'll build policies that will learn from that and will adapt going forward, so that it doesn't necessarily take like the bottom falling out of the economy to rejigger the unemployment system, for example. And so one could imagine having, just, and I'll put a pin in here for like evidence-driven policymaking, where you have that it's a real thing in government to like run experiments and to be continually adapting policies based on the evidence that's kind of being generated by the government. And that sort of form of fine-tuning the regulatory environment would probably be better than having no change for a long period of time and then all of a sudden rejiggering everything in a very short period of time. But I don't know, that's probably a ways off in the future.
Yeah, certainly the most hopeful thing I've heard in quite a while.
Yeah.
Can I actually ask you this, Suresh? I mean, do you see that? And I want to sort of link back to that first of the 3 vignettes that you shared with us. Do you see that process happening, either in the US or in any of the other democracies that you're studying now? And I should say, I love democracy, I really do. But the only place where I've seen anything like what you've described would be China's economic transition under the Deng Xiaoping era, where they were running these experiments. And that was perhaps, one of the least democratic systems that we've seen doing large-scale economic experimentation in some time. And so I'm just not sure, based on what you said earlier, if you have examples of that.
So I do have thoughts about this, because it's actually a really interesting thing that like in order to run experiments on a population that you haven't completely subjected, you need to have some basic legitimacy, that people are going to like accept that you're messing with them in their own interests. And so there's, any one of us that's had to fill out human subjects forms sort of gets this. It's like there needs to be some basic accountability between, when you're running experiments with people, the people that are doing the experiments need to have some sort of basic accountability to the people being experimented on. So when you're not an authoritarian country, if you want to have this like evidence-driven environment, you really need to have kind of a broad mandate. And so I'll actually suggest that Taiwan has been a democratic country that's actually just a response to COVID is kind of amazing. But also like kind of the democratic ways in which they've induced like citizen participation in contact tracing, and just kind of had a really open and scientifically informed policymaking environment. And I think it's sort of showing, and we neglect Taiwan because it's a small country, but I think its handling of COVID was both on the outcomes really good and also procedurally was pretty good.
They weren't doing the experiments that you were describing. They may have had scientifically driven policy, but it was not any kind of experimentation, at least not to my knowledge.
Well, I mean, no, they do have like small scale experiments, but that said, we actually have tons of experiments in the U.S. all the time that are just done on they're running governments like funding experiments to be done happens, I think, both in Taiwan and in the US. The problem is that the outputs aren't integrated into the policymaking environment. So we'll have like experiments like Job Corps or like the negative income tax experiments of the 1960s and 70s. And they happened, we got results back from them. They did sort of interestingly get, one of the reasons we have an earned income tax credit in the US is because of these outcomes of these negative income tax experiments that were done in the 60s and 70s. So, I don't think it's completely broken. I just think, I think we have examples of them happening, and there just needs to be much more systematic. This is much more systematic. I'd actually point out that the UK, particularly the conservative government in the UK has been pretty good about listening to evidence on things like the minimum wage, for example. They go out, they like ask, they sort of pre-commit to analyses of like what will the effects of their minimum wage increases be on unemployment, and when if they found a negative effect, they would think about scaling it back. And so I think we do have some, not a country that's like doing it whole scale, but particular sectors of policy where you do kind of have some of this like adaptive experimental feedback going on.
I want to pivot a little bit. There's a conversation going on in the chat with Jenna Bednar and David Krakauer and others about the sort of the intersection of COVID and inequality. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on sort of what this crisis might do, particularly in a US context, for inequality.
I mean, so I can talk about all the reasons it's a disaster for inequality. Like, I think the schools are just like, if we have another year of school closures, that the intergenerational consequences of that are probably going to be big, and that's and that. But let me, again, in my spirit of like silver linings, let me give a silver lining. So in particular, like, I think the movement of like the super high value tradable services in the US to remote work, and could actually like wind up moving a lot of economic activity out of the hubs of San Francisco, New York, LA, and into surrounding suburbs, into different towns, and so you can imagine little clusters of software developers or telemedicine in South Dakota or in South Carolina, and there's like a whole little economy around built up around like a set of remote workers that are doing kind of the high value services, and that really like deconcentrates a lot of the economy from these super high priced cities. And you can imagine that that's like a generally like distributing economic activity more equally around the country might in fact have like a larger egalitarian effect. So there's my silver lining. Also, just another plug for CARES. The CARES, I mean, that $600 a week for like those 3 months, that radically compressed the income distribution. And so I just like and very little evidence that it like disincentivized work in any way. So maybe if we just funded it out of a tax on Amazon, that would be fine.
Maybe, and I apologize for just sort of digging into the chat here, but Jenna, would you be amenable to sort of, because you had a sort of a slightly different opinion, it appears, from the chat. Would you mind sort of sharing that?
No, absolutely. And Suresh, so here's the question. First, in the work on silver linings, which I like, of course, because I'm an eternal optimist as well, have you seen, do you have a theory behind it in the sense of, so what is it that causes a transition to be an opportunity rather than a moment of crash? And then because Will's interested in what's, my little pushback to David in the chat on, is this inevitably a moment of greater inequality? For sure it is. But again, here, I'd love for you to share with everybody what you've been working on with equitable growth and shared prosperity. And thinking, is that, and I've been doing some work on that as well, as have others, is there something in this moment that might cause people to wake up and re-examine the structure of our political economy, the neoliberalism critique that's happening right now, that this may become an opportunity?
So I think so I think there is an opportunity. I worry, like I'm sure all of us worry, that there's and you know this better than me, there's just too many veto points around the American political system, that even if there is a big rethinking of the economy, it's right now that it's too hard to do it by the political system because of because of, of the structure of this rickety constitution.
No. I would say veto points, yes, but then there's a lot of complementarity. That is, we need to think a little bit differently about our political structure, and that maybe when we have failure at one level, we could have successes and progress at another level and learn from that. I'm sorry, I don't want to.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I maybe it's just like the past month that I'm just like, oh my God, this Constitution is like a disaster. It's, that really the undemocratic components of the Constitution are like really like slapping you in the face these days. And so that's really interesting that there might actually be levels of consensus kind of hiding despite like what looks like all of the obstacles to changing stuff. But yeah, I actually think you can win the war of ideas, but you just actually like lose the actual war.
Sorry, Sam Bowles, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, there are two things quite different. One is about learning from social policy experiments. There are really two interesting cases to me. In the around the turn of the last century, the progressive movement in the upper Northwest in the prior to the First World War, those upper Midwest states passed a lot of very progressive social legislation, workmen's compensation, and a whole bunch of other things. And they then became the basis of a lot of policies which were pretty quickly passed after that in the New Deal. And that's a very short lag. That's a 25-year, 30-year lag. And of course, I mean, it wasn't just copying them, but they were there and they seemed legitimate and so on. But then contrast that with something that Suresh knows, because Suresh is from Canada, I mean, how can we possibly be living next to this country, which we consider so similar to us? And there is so little learning about the Canadian healthcare system. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact that we just don't look at the data and say, oh, maybe we aren't the best healthcare system in the world and so on. It doesn't involve going and doing exotic calculations with other countries whose languages we don't understand. So those are two very different experiences in American social policy.
So, but let me go ahead.
I wanted to come back, Suresh, to what you said at the end about the war of ideas. I think you're right. I don't think that it's silver lining. I think the COVID crisis and climate change together are really going to kill the idea that individualism and unregulated profit seeking is a way to organize an economy. We have no idea what's going to replace it. And I think there's a lot of vacuums there, but it's really going to be very hard to sustain the neoliberal rhetoric or even the neoliberal models. And
yeah, so I actually agree with you. I think that's dead. My worry is more like this, is that like we're now splitting down on like who's in the group and who's out of the group.
Absolutely. I think it isn't at all clear. Wendy and I, and we've been talking with Suresh also, have written there's these possibilities of changing to a way of understanding the economy and society, which places much more importance on what we call community or civil society. It's not just a debate between governments and markets, but there's communities and other interpersonal relationships governed by values other than obedience and greed. Yes, that's fine. But among those motives that are very operative in civil society is us versus them, call it tribalism. That's also a big possibility here. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot at stake now. But I think it's, I mean, as Suresh said, it's a time that there's just a lot up for grabs. And that's, it's worth spending some time working on it.
I can respond to the point about like educating our inner city children. I agree it's been ongoing for decades, but what's sort of surprising is that we've actually have had moments where we've made real dents in inequality. And you know, that in both racial inequality, for example, like recent research has really shown that the 1966 expansion of the minimum wage to sectors that were exempted from the FLSA really like put a real big dent in racial wage inequality, much more so than sort of affirmative action and title and the Civil Rights Act. It was like actually just pushing up the wage in traditionally exempt sectors of the South, like textiles that really sort of like put a big dent. So I think there's lots of things. I mean, education's important. No one will deny it, but it shouldn't be. I think there's lots of things you can do as well as educational reform that makes a big dent in various measures of inequality.
One of the other themes that we've seen earlier today, and I expect we'll see more of tomorrow, has to do with sort of information and belief flows. And I know, Nancy, do you have a question related to this?
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm Nancy Hayden. I was interested, going back to what you were talking about, the democratic transitions, and really appreciated what you were saying about looking back and finding use cases that have the same economic downturn preceding the economic upturn after a democratic transition. A different way of looking at democratic transitions that I found so fascinating was in the literature and the democracy transition scholarship, the ones that go back and look over history. We tend to think that democracy is a modern invention, but in fact, it's several thousand years old. And there's a fair amount of good historic data about the ancient Greek city-states and some of the other experiments that preceded the modern one. And as I recall, some of those comparative studies looking at like why some city-states in Greece, ancient Greece, evolved more democratically than others, or some isolated examples in Rome, that a lot had to do with the networks and road systems and communication systems. And I was wondering if you saw anything like that in some of the kind of more modern studies and comparisons you've done, and or if you've ever gone back and tried to replicate these kind of comparative studies in transitions that have been done historically and seen anything new with your approach.
Wow. So the data gets a lot worse the further back you go, and so it's really hard, or it takes these kinds of giant data collection exercises like the kind that Sam does to produce these kinds of statistics like for ancient societies. I actually suspect somebody has tried to do this for the city-states of ancient Greece, but I can't remember the reference. And it's just really hard to get like a measure of economic activity in, like, even measuring GDP in a classical economy is just kind of really hard. Most people don't work for a wage. So just measuring like prosperity is just kind of a tough thing to do, even for just like a one society in the ancient period.
So do you have any thoughts, just conjecture even maybe, would it be worth exploring the connection between the economic activity and the kinds of communication, information, proximity networks?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's like one of our big challenges. I mean, what we would love to do, it's kind of a very interesting time in social science in that like we're now just like now getting, I should have maybe we're just finally now getting the granularity in the data that would let us examine the things that we have always thought were really important for historical transitions. So, for example, like with the COVID crisis, the granularity of the data that's getting released in real time, that you can kind of really see, like I've been working with geolocation data where you can literally see people attending the Black Lives Matter protests, and you can see all the clumping of the device IDs like in the streets. And that's the kind of thing that we think really is a precipitator of these kinds of institutional changes, the kind I'm talking about. But we could really only measure this kind of informal social gatherings, the networks, the patterns of communication, I think we've only just begun to start to be able to measure them in kind of in a systematic way.
Yeah, so just to kind of keep digging just one more little bit. So what I was really looking, I know that we find that interesting. What I was thinking about was the correlation or not with the economic trends that you were looking at, especially going back and saying, here was this downturn. So it's putting those two together. So, you know, we all know the story about the Arab Spring and the role that the networks made there, and that this was following, as you were saying, you know, the crash in the cereal market. But you've got this larger set of economic data and these larger patterns of communications, even beyond social media. And for me, I feel like there's a deeper story there than just one about, you know, the crashing cereal markets and social media.
So you mean something like the ideas in the air, or what people are talking about?
Yeah, just in the many layers of communication networks, and how it's not just communication networks, but it's the economic distribution networks. It's just all of the information networks are much more than social media, and they underline the economic activity in a country, and the economic the kind of network that underlies the economy in a democratic in a transition to a democratic country is very different than the kind of network and information systems that you have that underlie financial and economics in a, you know, in an authoritarian country, for example. And so just, it seems like there's a richer story than it's just, oh, we had, you know, GDP changes, and
absolutely
it's much more complex and set of networks there.
Yeah. I'll just give you one anecdotal thing about what I've looked at and like never turned into a paper of any form, but like with value-added tax data, you can kind of actually see the whole network of firm-to-firm interactions in a country, because like every transaction between firms is logged for the tax authority. And so one of the very interesting things to look at this in like an authoritarian country like Russia, where has a VAT, and you can kind of look at the so you basically see like all of the economic activity kind of oriented towards the companies that are very close to the government. For example, so the state-owned oil companies, the state-owned banks, basically the companies that are owned by people that are close to by oligarchs that are close to Putin. Those are the kinds of companies that economic activity is like directed towards. And you would think that like, oh, once you kind of remove the power of the government, you would probably get a total reconfiguration of that network, for example.
So in the interest of time, I'm afraid we are going to have to sort of truncate here, but I want to invite everyone to thank Suresh again. This was a fascinating talk and really leads us up for a lot of the conversation that we're going to be having tomorrow. So again, I know applause doesn't work well over Zoom, but we can use our sort of reaction buttons. Thank you very much.